5 secrets to Waterslide decal application. Right now. Bob Johnson with PK&W Railroad coming at you with another video. If you want some unique prototype equipment like these FEC containers, or you have a Freelance model railroad like me, you're going to need to apply some decals. I love using Waterslide decals, but I know some people struggle with them. Here are my 5 top tips for having success applying Waterslide decals. And stay tuned for my 6th bonus tip at the end of the video. Tip number 1, you have to apply Waterslide decals to a glossy surface. This is the most important tip that I'm going to give you in this video. If you do nothing else, do this. You've either got to break out your airbrush and apply gloss where the decals are actually going to go on the model, or if you're lazy like me, you're going to just shoot the entire model with some gloss lacquer before you apply the decals. If you don't apply the decals to a glossy surface, you risk getting silvering, which is where the clear part of the decal does not adhere to the model surface and it looks all silvery. It looks just terrible. It looks like a decal. And there's really no way to fix it except stripping off the decal and starting over again. And by the way, working on a gloss surface, if you just put another decal on top of a non-gloss surface, you're probably going to get more silvering. Of course, when you're done with the model, you're going to have to spray it with matte lacquer in order to get it back to a non-glossy surface. So it's a lot of work, but you cannot skip this step. This is the single most important step to decal application. I know it's obvious to some of you veterans, but everybody watching this video is not necessarily experienced. Tip number 2, use decal setting solutions. Again, I know this is obvious to veterans, but it may not be to beginners. Decal setting solutions soften the decal and allow them to adhere to complex surfaces like these corrugated containers here. I've only used the micro scale decal setting solution system and I've been very happy with it. I'm sure there are others. There are 2 bottles in the set, micro set, which is what you use first, and micro sol, which is what you use second. Now set you put on before you apply the decal to the surface. You put it exactly where you want the decal to be, make a little puddle of it, cover the whole area as best as you can. It'll beat up a little bit, but that's all right. It'll spread out once the decal is down there on the surface. You then slide the decal into that area, and I wait a few minutes, and then I blot off the excess micro set and force the decal down against the details as much as possible on the model. You then take micro sol and you apply that liberally on the surface and you just leave it there. You let it dry naturally. And if your decal gets all wrinkly, don't freak out. Don't freak out. Just leave it there. It will dry flat. I've never had it not dry flat, even when it wrinkles up. And it really adheres to the surface. It'll pull the decal down into the detail on the model and make it look painted on. Now, don't turn the model over or turn the model on its side while the micro sol is doing its work. You want gravity to help you and pull the decal down into the recesses. I use a pretty big number 5 brush for applying decals. It carries a lot of solution. You really want to soak the decals well with micro sol. Now, once the micro sol is dry, you want to look for air bubbles underneath your decal. You may have to hold the model at different angles to the light because those little mother effers are hard to see, those little bubbles, but they could very well be there, especially on something like a corrugated container. And what you do is when you see one of these bubbles, you pierce it numerous times with a pin or with the tip of a very sharp X-Acto blade. I mean, pierce it repeatedly. Then you want to soak it again with micro sol. And I sometimes will stipple the micro sol, get the brush going on a vertical direction and force the bristles down into that area so that you can force the micro sol underneath the decal in that bubble. And then let it dry again, and hopefully that bubble will be gone, but you may need to do it again. Tip number 3, use distilled water. If you live in an area with hard water like I often do, you can get white rings that when the decal setting solution's dry and everything, you might get some white rings around there. Some of that might be adhesive from the decal as well. So I try to save myself that trouble by using distilled water. For 99 cents, you can afford it. It's worth it if it's going to save you a few minutes. You can clear that residue off with a damp cotton swab if it does appear, but why bother when you can just use distilled water? Tip number 4, clean, clean, clean. You don't want anything to affect the ability of your decals to stick to the surface, and you don't want dust or other particles to be trapped underneath your decal when you put it on. Nightmare. So what do you have to do? Clean. You got to wash your hands thoroughly before you do decaling to make sure there's no oils on your hands. Don't touch your face while you're doing this process. You'll pick up more oils. Clean your work surface. I vacuum my work surface before I decal to make sure there's no dust or debris. Make sure your model is crystal clean. No dust, nothing on it. Blow it clean. If you see any debris on there, anything, blow it clean, brush it clean, do what you have to do to make sure the model surface is also clean. And lastly, make sure that your solutions that you're using are all clean and that your brush is clean. Use fresh water frequently. Use a separate container to rinse off your brush. I use my brush for microset, for microsol, and for the water in the decal, but every time in between I have a separate container with a lot of distilled water in it, and I rinse the brush off very well in that container so that there's no residual materials getting transferred into the water dish where the decals might be getting their fresh distilled water from. Tip number 5, don't drop small decals into any container of water. Just don't do it. It's way too hard. You're fishing around, pushing them up against the side of the container, trying to get them out. While you do that, the decal separates from the backing sheet. Now it's floating around in there. Really a pain, especially if it's a long, skinny decal, snake-like decal. That thing will wrap around your brush. It'll be very, very hard to get out of the water. So don't do it at all. Just put the small decals on your cutting surface and transfer some distilled water from your clean distilled water container over to the mat. Touch it underneath the decal. The backing paper will absorb all that water. You can put some on top if you want to, and that will work right there. Maybe you have to transfer a little bit more, but eventually the decal will soften and come off and become loose. So I only put large decals in water, and then I just dip them and pull them out again and set them on the cutting mat, because you don't want to be fishing around for your decals in the water. Speaking of containers, go to an estate sale and get a small dish like this, maybe 1 or 2. It'll only cost you a few cents, and you won't be using the household saucers and dinnerware for your decaling projects and putting a setting solution on the household plates. I'm sure that'll be appreciated. Also, if you're working with white decals, you may want to use a dark dish just to make sure that nothing gets lost. If a decal was to somehow come off the backing paper and start floating around, you would see it right away. You'll see if they start separating from the backing paper when they're in the water. Just might be easier to use a black container at that time. So once you've got the decal soaking on your cutting mat, you want to touch them periodically with the tip of your brush. When they start moving, you know it's time to put them on the model. Take your microset, soak the area where you're going to put them, pick up the backing paper and the decal and put it on the model adjacent to the spot where the decal is going to go, and slide that decal off onto the model where it needs to go, and then make final adjustments with the tip of your brush. Now with really small decals, I sometimes just coax them off the backing paper while on the mat and pick them up without the backing paper off the mat and just put them in place on the model. Not always easy to do. When you get the brush carrying the small decal onto the surface of the model, you have to kind of get a tip of the decal sticking to the model and then kind of turn your brush and leave the decal behind. Kind of a little twisting motion, but it's not hard. You may find that's easier than transferring the backing paper and sliding it off. So those are my 5 tips, but what's my 6th bonus tip? Well, if you make your own decals or you buy decals from a smaller manufacturer like Circuit City, the entire decal is going to be a clear decal backing. On the big decal manufacturers who are doing silk screen printing, they're going to lay down a clear coat that's almost the same size as the printed area of the decal. You don't have much of an overlap. So you don't have to really be careful about cutting them out. But on the homemade decals or from smaller manufacturers, you've got to cut the decal close. You got to cut close to the decal, because how close you cut determines how big that clear surround area is on the decal when you apply it. Now, the easy way to cut the decals off usually is to make 2 vertical cuts, 2 horizontal cuts, and you've cut out a little box around the decal that you are getting ready to remove from the sheet. Well, that leaves the edges of the decal as a right angle, and those right angles tend to catch light once they're applied. And also, they can kind of fold under and make it a little more difficult to get the decal to lay flat. So the solution to this is, once you cut it out with right angle edges, take a pair of scissors or your extra sharp X-Acto knife, and you need to be using a really sharp knife for this work. This is time for a new blade when you start doing decal work. Cut that edge on a curve. Just cut a curve around that edge. That won't catch as much light, it won't catch the eye when the decal is laying flat. I hope you find the video helpful, and if you do, please give me a thumbs up and let me know what you might like to see on future videos. Until next time, this is Bob Johnson with PK&W Railroad signing off. Look, get off your keister and start building something today. You'll be glad you did. Until next time, happy modeling.